Welcome everybody to the Webequie Supply Road virtual VR information session specifically for Marten Falls First Nations. This is part of an additional set of activities for Indigenous communities that we're engaging with. We have 22 Indigenous communities that we're engaging with. And as part of WSR approved terms of reference, we're doing 3 rounds of individual First Nations engagement information sessions, specifically for the WSR, and we're setting these up throughout from April to August, one for each of the communities, and this week is Marten Falls First Nations. We encourage folks to from Marten Falls to come to the landing page specifically for Marten Falls. I think it's supplyroad.ca/Marten Falls First Nations. You'll find this video and information around how you can follow up with comments or any issues or concerns or impacts you may want to share with us. If Marten Falls members want to have additional sessions, whether virtually or face-to-face, our team that's online here with Dawn, Marion, Brianna, and Stephanie, we're going to be flexible for the throughout the spring, summer to do that, so that if you want to meet in Thunder Bay or Marten Falls or elsewhere face to face, we're going to be flexible and adaptable for such requests. So I'm here with Dawn Parkson from SNC, and Dawn, maybe you can say a few words before the presentation.
Sure will. Thanks, Mike. Today we're going to reintroduce the project to everyone, and then talk a bit about the process involved in the environmental or impact assessment. We're going to talk about engagement and consultation that has been done to date and what we have heard from the many communities that we have talked to and visited. Next, we're going to talk about the study plans, and study plans are the recipe for what we're going to do when it comes to the different studies that make up the environmental assessment or the impact assessment. After that, we're going to talk about the assessment approach, the effects assessment approach that is going to be undertaken as part of this work. Then we are going to talk about select valued components. Select valued components are the things that have been identified by the general public, by community members, by government agencies as very important that need to be studied. So we're going to talk about those. Then we're going to talk about the Indigenous Knowledge Program, which is a key cornerstone part of the environmental assessment. And then after that, we're going to talk about the different alternatives considered and being evaluated, as well as the alternatives, not just for the route of the road, but for aggregate areas and other sort of facilities that are involved, lay down areas for storing equipment, and then areas for the construction camps. And then we're going to finish off with a discussion of the consultation approach and next steps. So we have a lot to talk to you about, and this is a pre-recorded presentation that we're going to play for you. And after that, we're going to have Michael and I are going to have a short discussion on some of the issues raised by Marten Falls community. And then after that, we're going to take any questions that the community may have, or respond to any issues that the community may have as well about the project. So we are ready to go. So if our team can play the presentation, we'll do that. And then welcome to the Webequie Supply Road Environmental Assessment Phase Round 1 presentation. Today we are going to talk about the environmental assessment steps, what we have learned from communities, the importance of Indigenous knowledge, road route alternatives, and what happens next. For background, Webequie First Nation is about 250 kilometers from the Hudson Bay and James Bay coasts, and the road runs south of Webequie and then east to the Ring of Fire area. The purpose of the Webequie Supply Road is to move people and supplies to the Ring of Fire area, create jobs and business opportunities for community members, as well as skills training opportunities for young people. This would be done in a way that will preserve and strengthen the community's language and culture. The road will be 107 kilometers long, with 17 kilometers of the length actually within Webequie First Nation reserve lands. The corridor planning area is 2 kilometers, but the actual cleared area will be 35 meters. The road will make 3 large water crossings, one across Winnisk Lake and the other 2 across rivers. And the project will also include temporary pits and quarries, equipment storage areas, and construction camps. Now we are going to talk about the environmental and impact assessment processes. There are 2 environmental assessments actually going on. There's an Ontario or provincial one and a Canada or federal one. Webequie is also doing their own internal assessment of the project. At the end, one report is created for review by Ontario and Canada. There is coordination between the federal and provincial EA processes at different points in the process. One body of documentation, though, one report, one body of documentation will be produced to address requirements of both the terms of reference, which is the provincial work plan for the EA, and what we call the tailored impact statement guidelines, which is basically the work plan from the federal side. Now we are going to talk about the communication we have had with Indigenous communities. When we were developing the work plan for the environmental assessment, also known as the terms of reference for the provincial environmental assessment process, we created a project website. We sent notices to communities, did virtual and in-person community meetings, and made project information available in many ways, such as through the website or by mail. And we've also accommodated during COVID by switching a lot of our in-person meetings to virtual meetings. We have received comments on the environmental assessment terms of reference or environmental assessment work plan from many First Nations and First Nation organizations. These comments are wide-ranging. They talk about many, many different topics. Some of the topics are focused on Aboriginal and treaty rights and interests. There's cumulative effects and the need for regional assessment. So looking at the broader effects of the project and looking at the project from a much sort of higher level in combination with other projects that are either planned or exist in the area. We heard comments on protocols, so ways of communicating with communities and the consultation process. We heard comments on environmental assessment or impact assessment, the actual undertaking of that work. And then we also received comments on participation in capacity funding, providing resources to communities so that they have the capacity to be able to review documents and conduct their own, for example, Indigenous knowledge studies. There were other comments on ownership and maintenance or operations of the road. There were comments on socioeconomic impacts of the project. There were a number of comments on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, as well as water or water quality, and wildlife and plants had many comments as well. So there were comments from a lot of communities, a lot of First Nation organizations, and about many different subjects. Let's move now to talk a bit about the study plans. There are many studies involved in an environmental assessment. The technical team had to prepare detailed plans explaining to the federal government how these studies will be done. So these are very detailed sort of recipes as to how the work will be undertaken at a very technical level, and these were reviewed by the federal government, by experts in the federal government. So there were a number of different technical study plans prepared, and the subjects include geology, terrain and soils, surface and groundwater, air quality and climate change, noise and acoustic, vegetation, wildlife, fish and fish habitat, species at risk, socioeconomics, human health, visual environment, and cumulative effects. Our team also prepared fact sheets to summarize. Now we will talk about how an environmental assessment is done. There are many steps involved in an environmental assessment. One of the steps is to identify what we call valued components. Valued components are the environmental, health, social, economic, or additional elements or conditions of the natural and human environment that may be affected by the project and are important to community members, are of concern or value to the public, Indigenous peoples, federal, provincial authorities, and interested party. They are what people are concerned about. Then we have indicators. Indicators represent the resource, feature, or issue related to a valued component, so what's important to community members. And if these indicators are changed, they may demonstrate an effect on the environment. A better way probably to describe them is a way of measuring potential effects. And it's used in the assessment and evaluation of alternative routes and the overall effects of the project. Now let's talk a bit about assessment boundaries. For each thing that community members think is important to study in an environmental assessment, a valued component, a study area needs to be defined. These are different depending on the valued component, and that's a very important thing to remember. So there are three general study areas. What we call the project area or project footprint. Then we have 1 kilometer on either side of the road center, which is called the local study area, and the regional study area, which is 5 kilometers on each side of the center line of the road. Those are the general study areas. And this next map shows the three basic types of study areas relative to the two alternatives, the community-based alternative and the technically preferred alternative, which looks at the community-based alternative and makes minor changes to the route based on better terrain and soils and other factors. Let's now talk about the study areas for valued components more specifically. The study areas for valued components, or things that are important to community members, are determined by many different things, including what community members are saying, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous land and resource use, and Aboriginal and treaty rights. Now we're going to move to talk a little bit about baseline studies. Think of baseline studies as a way of finding out the way things are now, so what we call existing conditions. And if we know that, we have something to compare to when looking at possible impacts of the project. So it's a snapshot, a picture of the way things are before the project. There are many studies that are done as part of an environmental assessment. These studies look at three general areas: the natural, or what we call biophysical, socioeconomic, and cultural. They're all under these categories. For example, let's look at natural or biophysical. Within that, we would have studies on vegetation, such as the peatlands or wetlands and forests, wildlife, fish and fish habitat, species at risk, air quality and climate change, noise and vibration, visual environment, surface water, groundwater, and geology, terrain, and soils. So there are many studies on the natural or biophysical, in the natural or biophysical category. Now, if we look at the socioeconomic infrastructure and social services, then we might look at human health. We might look at land and resource use, or indigenous knowledge and land and resource use. Then we look at another major category of studies, which is archaeological resources or built heritage or cultural heritage landscapes. So there are many groups of studies, and even within the studies that I mentioned, there are more studies that are done, more specific studies. For example, if we were to look at caribou, there are a number of different types of caribou studies that are done as part of an environmental assessment or an impact assessment. Let's now look at select valued components as examples. And this will hopefully help everyone sort of better understand what I've just been talking about. So let's look at study areas for wildlife. The general or local study area would be a 1 kilometer buffer, as I mentioned before, from the center line of the alternatives, 500 kilometers from what we call supportive infrastructure. So these are things other than the road that are required as part of the construction or operation of the project. These might be camps or aggregate or rock source areas or access roads. And then the regional study area, general regional study area, extends 5 kilometers on either side of the local study area boundaries. If we look at moose, for example, that has a different local study area. In that case, it's 10 kilometers from the center line of the alternatives, 500 meters from supportive infrastructure, but the regional study area extends 50 kilometers from either side of the local study area boundaries. Then we look at caribou. Caribou have an 11-kilometer buffer from the center line of the two alternatives, and from the same distance from supportive infrastructure camps. So it has a bigger distance around it to define the local study area. And then the regional study area for caribou includes entire ranges of caribou, which is these are very, very large areas. Next, and finally for wildlife, let's look at wolverine. Wolverine has an 11-kilometer buffer from the center line of the alternatives and from the supportive infrastructure, and it extends 50 kilometers from either side of the local study area boundaries. Let's have a look now what that means in terms of maps. So these next few maps will illustrate the different types of study areas I just discussed. So this first one is the general study areas that I was talking about. The next slide shows the different local and regional study areas for moose. And then after that, we have the wildlife study areas for wolverine. So as you can tell, you can see the 50-kilometer buffer around there, much larger area. And then finally, the largest study area you can see here, you can see the local study area on the actual map, and then the regional study area, which includes 2 ranges for caribou, and that is in the upper right corner. So it's a much larger area. So let's talk a little bit about wildlife again and some of the criteria or valued components associated with wildlife, just to give you an idea of and a better understanding through examples. So for wildlife, you might have forest birds, you might have raptors, you might have shorebirds or waterfowl, or bog and fen birds like muskeg birds and other wetland birds. You might have bats or fur-bearing animals like lynx or rabbits. Ungulates, which are moose, for example, amphibians and reptiles, and then pollinating insects as well. So the indicators or the ways of measuring those could be, for example, changes to habitat availability, the quantity of habitat available. Is that impacted by the road? Could be changes to abundance, meaning actual numbers, or the distribution, the spatial distribution, where these animals are over the land or water. Could be changes in the species richness. And we talk about that, we mean the diversity of species, the number of different species. Could be changes to survival and reproduction. Could be changes to predator access, habitat use, and population. Or it could be changes in wildlife mortality or due to stress from. So let's talk a little bit about the baseline studies for birds. Spring and fall aerial water bird surveys were conducted in 2019 and 2020. And some of the things that we found were that the large lakes, and this isn't that surprising, were staging areas for waterfowl. Smaller lakes and rivers aren't really used that much by migrating waterfowl. We also conducted breeding bird surveys in 2020 and 2021. And we did listening counts at 263 stations. And we also used things called acoustic recording units at many different locations, actually 89 different locations, to listen to the sounds in these areas. The next slide shows some pictures that were taken from our breeding bird survey fieldwork. We also conducted baseline studies on bats to look basically for how many species are present. So we looked at, as I mentioned, bat diversity or number of species, and we used listening devices, what we call ultrasonic recorders. And we did surveys at 10 different locations. We found 5 species of bat, including the little brown bat, which is endangered in Ontario. We conducted a number of baseline studies on caribou as well. Caribou aerial surveys were conducted in 2018, 2019, and 2021. These are aerial surveys where we have biologists looking down and counting the number of caribou and identifying male, female, and making other observations about other large mammals. We also conducted in 2020 a caribou calving study, both by foot and by helicopter. We conducted a caribou collaring study in 2021, and that helped us identify calving areas where community members where caribou would have their young, winter areas, and identify travel corridors by being able to track the individual caribou across the landscape. And so far, the data has shown that most collared caribou are of what we call the eastern migratory population that winters in wooded areas, but actually has their young along the Hudson Bay shoreline. Next are a few pictures of some of our from some of our caribou aerial surveys. And then the slide after that shows photos from our collaring study as well. So let's talk a little bit next about baseline studies for wolverine and amphibians. We conducted, starting in 2021, a wolverine occupancy study. And so we set up sampling stations called run poles that at 25 different sites within 10 kilometers of the planned road center line. And then these stations were set up to include what we call snag posts to collect hair from the animals that would visit. And then there were wildlife cameras set up. From this work, not only did we get a boundary of wolverine in Ontario, and we've gotten some really interesting results from that. We also did some amphibian studies where we sampled for calling frogs by using these acoustic recording units that we had set up for breeding bird studies. And this allowed for evening surveys to be done in these remote muskeg or wetland areas that we wouldn't be able to get access to otherwise. So next, let's move on to talk a little bit about Indigenous knowledge. A big part of an environmental assessment is Indigenous knowledge. We have, with the Webequie Supply Road project, an Indigenous knowledge program. We need communities to share their Indigenous knowledge with the technical team to help us identify potential project effects. This helps us avoid or reduce potential effects on Indigenous rights and interests. As part of doing this work, we take the Indigenous knowledge that we are able to collect. We make sure that it is kept confidential to whatever degree the community would like us to. And then we combine this information with the Western science information to very comprehensively identify impacts of the project. We want to work together with your community to collect important Indigenous knowledge. As I mentioned, we will respect the need for confidentiality. We have communicated with communities about the need to collect Indigenous knowledge for the project, and we've also invited communities to participate in our Indigenous knowledge program. So again, this is a very, very important part of this environmental and impact assessment, collecting Indigenous knowledge. And we really would like to encourage communities to provide that input to us so we can make sure that we've assessed impacts of the project very, very thoroughly. Let's move now to talk a bit about consideration and evaluation of alternatives. We have different route alternatives that have been developed by working with community members. Of the two alternatives, one is what we call the community preferred route, and the other is based on where the best land for road building is. So it's sort of the technically preferred route. We're also looking at different locations for sources of road building material, such as gravel and rock. This next map shows the two alternatives. In yellow is the community preferred route, which was derived by Webequie First Nation members meeting over a fairly long period of time to discuss the best possible route for the road. And then the green line represents technically preferred version of that route, looking at the best areas to travel through in terms of best terrain to build in generally, and other factors as well. Each alternative does get evaluated in detail, and there are many factors involved in that evaluation, such as natural environment, Indigenous knowledge, land and resource use and interest, socioeconomic and cultural heritage, and of course the technical side, cost, constructability, and safety. And the purpose of the evaluation of these routes and aggregate or rock sources is to identify a preferred route and preferred locations for sources for aggregate and rock that has the least potential for bad effects, for negative effects, and the greatest opportunity for controlling those negative or bad effects and offers the community the greatest benefit as well. The evaluation of alternatives also considers other facilities that are part of building the road, such as temporary access roads to get to those gravel pits and quarries, for example, to get to the laydown and storage yards, construction camps, as well as bridges. Let's talk a little bit about consultation approach and next steps. We will be talking to communities in the next few months. We have 3 rounds of consultation planned as part of the environmental assessment phase of the project. This presentation is for round 1. But as you can see in this slide, we have the 2 other rounds, round 2 coming up hopefully in fall of 2022, and in winter or spring of 2023, the final round, round 3. This round talks about the overall IA process. It talks about the IK program. It talks about criteria and indicators, the evaluation of alternatives. The next round, round 2, will summarize the input that we got, identify alternatives, identify preferred routes for the road and aggregate or rock source areas, and provide some preliminary engineering design elements. And then finally, round 3 will be a summary of round 2, what we found in round 2, and a summary of preliminary effects, early effects based on our analysis of the project, and proposed ways of managing project impacts or mitigating impacts, limiting or controlling impacts, and then talking about follow-up monitoring, either during construction or post-construction. We will be collecting your feedback on the project in many ways, including community meetings, interviews, open houses, live streaming sessions, the project website, and social media. There are many different ways available to collect feedback from your community, and we welcome input from you in terms of how you would like to communicate with us. In terms of next steps, let me just talk about where we are here now. We are looking for input to finalize the criteria and indicators, as well as identify study areas for the valued components. We're looking to continue with our baseline studies and collect Indigenous knowledge. Now, in fall of 2022, we're looking for input to evaluation of alternatives and selection of the preferred route and locations for the construction material sources, aggregate and rock. And we'll be doing the preliminary engineering design of the road. Then, in winter of 2023, we'll be getting input to preliminary effects, assessment of the project, and input to proposed impact management, mitigation, and follow-up monitoring. And then finally, in the summer and fall of 2023, there would be a review of the draft and final environmental assessment report or impact statement, the document that goes to both the provincial and federal governments. We want to hear from you. Please provide us with your comments through the project website, which is supplyroad.ca. Speak with the project team after the presentation. Fill out a feedback form. We have contact information on the screen for you. We welcome your input. We will respond to you, and it will make the environmental assessment and impact assessment better with your input. Thank you for joining us today. Miigwech, and we will see you soon. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Right now, we're going to talk a little bit about the issues raised by Marten Falls First Nation during the terms of reference phase of the Webequie Supply Road project. And there were mainly 3 issues that were raised. The first was to look at the community had concerns about the impacts of blasting in the event that rock is required, that blasting is required, that aggregate is not easily available. And these are, very reasonable issues raised. And the concerns were with regard to impacts of blasting on groundwater, noise and vibration, climate change. So that relates to, I think, really the operation of a crushing operation to take the rock that's been blasted and break it down into the smaller materials to maintain the road width. And so that, climate change, you're talking about increased emissions, greenhouse gases. And then the other one was habitat fragmentation due to the blasting that goes on as well. So that was one that was brought up by community members. There was also a concern about which projects would be looked at as part of the assessment of future developments. In the cumulative side effects studies. So we provided a list of the projects that we were going to look at. These are what you call reasonably foreseeable projects, planned for the future or from the past as well. And then another big issue, which has been raised by other communities, understandably, is because part of the road runs through the James Bay lowlands. There was a concern about any peat removal as part of the construction of the road, and we've talked about this issue before, and this is something that's, it's a very sensitive area, and we are mindful of that, and we are doing everything we can in the design to ensure that a very limited amount of peat would actually be removed as well. And so by doing that, there would be less exposure of that peat to the air, and you're not affecting the carbon sink to the extent that you could be. So this is an issue. Building in these areas is definitely a complicated issue, but it's an issue that where there are lots of examples available of the right way to do things. So we are looking at those best practices and using that information to guide us in the preliminary design of the road. So I don't know if Michael's there, but there's a number of issues that were raised by the community, and I think I think there he is.
Ew.
But there he is. Mike, I was just talking about some of the issues here, and one of the issues brought up by the community was impacts of blasting, which is understandable. We're quite sure, I think, at this point that we're going to need to do blasting in certain areas to get enough material to at least maintain the road. But of course, we'll do everything we can to limit those activities, won't we, Mike?
Yeah, so this area is challenging. It has different, it's part Canadian Shield, it's part Hudson Bay lowlands, and with it comes with technical challenges. So part of the challenges, or part of the effort, I guess our team is doing it, is sort of the preliminary design of that road, and so part of that design is sort of this idea of a geogrid, and if you visit our website, I think we actually got a video of the idea. At least gives you some intuition of what a geogrid may look like, and it's sort of this floating road concept where it sits on the peat or bog, and that allows the groundwater to continue to flow, because it's almost imperceptible, but the water does flow, like you sort of have the peat layer, I guess you can say, or the vegetation, and it looks like, the landscape is still, but there's water actually moving.
Very slowly, isn't it?
Very, very, very slowly.
Yeah.
So designing a road, for this, parts of it, will be this geogrid, and then there's others will be your traditional road with foundations and maintenance. So the blasting, that people maybe were, it's probably associated with the aggregates. So in the remote communities, all the remote flying communities need aggregates for their airstrip, and most of these communities, that operate part of the airport, there are certain standards. MTO, actually Transport Canada requires airplanes to land. So these scheduled flights that land, or the airline that provides scheduled flights, and they have to land on airstrips that up to a certain code in the eyes of Transport Canada. If they don't, if they start landing on airstrips or sort of half made somewhere else, they can lose the aviation license.
Yeah.
For landing on such substandard airstrips. So part of that maintenance of airstrips is actually aggregates. And so you'll see stockpiles of aggregates, in airstrips where they have to blast and crush and sift through different grades, that they need for that airstrip. So that's probably a direct reference point, where some of these concerns come from, because when they blast and crushed and the sort of the dust, etc. So it's a very how do you call it, intuitive question to ask. It's like, okay, well, we got an all season road now, and how much blasting are you going to be doing, to construct the road and then maintain and operate the road? So we don't have a definitive answer at this point. But just remember, I guess, that part of the road will be this geogrid setting where it's kind of like a floating road, and then other parts may be actually have a foundation where the blasting may be required to maintain parts of that road.
Yeah, and what you're saying, Mike, too, is that community members are pretty familiar with those kinds of activities, right? Because it is done on a relatively frequent basis to maintain those runways, isn't it? So
It's
it's
getting
not
harder
something.
and harder too, like because
Yeah.
the aggregates are further away all the time.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. And I know our team is still trying to finalize exactly where their supplies of aggregates are going to come from. And there are some big reserves from what they've been able to identify, but there may, even if there is enough aggregate available just through what they find, they may need other sizes of rock, right, for
Mhm.
other applications. So around culvert pipes, for example, you'll often see sort of like a medium-sized stone, like bigger than gravel, obviously, and they put that around culvert pipes so that the opening, they don't wash out in
Mhm.
heavy rain events, to protect them basically from washouts and erosion. So you know most of these kinds of projects do require some kind of quarrying activity to some degree, and obviously like we were talking about, because of the nature of the work, we want to limit that as much as we can, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a big one. And yeah, and then the other comment that we got, Mike, was just they were asking for information about cumulative social effects, actually, in this case. And they were asking for which projects were going to be considered as part of a cumulative effects analysis. So, you and I both know we have a defined list of projects that we have to look at, whether they're past projects or future projects. We have to look at those and put those in and think about them all together to look at those impacts of all of them, the cumulative impacts. So we'll be.
That's pretty interesting. What I like about that is it is a concern. It's a reoccurring concern about I guess the number of projects. So a lot of folks think of the Ring of Fire as a cluster of projects, I guess, that is yet to be. Remember, the it's been 15 years since the discovery. Like I got a lot grayer since 15 years ago. It's like, so 15 years, people have been thinking about this, and since the initial staking rush in 2007 in the discovery. And now, with these individual projects, Webequie Supply Road, as an economic development road, and Marten Falls Community Access Road and Northern Road Link now commencing on their tour process. Cumulative effects, all three projects are mandated to do cumulative effects assessment.
Yeah.
So like there's going to be 3 cumulative effects assessments just on the current project. So that's a good thing. Just to tell people that, it's not a side thing, what, because the projects, let's do a cumulative effects assessment. No, it's part of the core activities that has to be done on all 3 projects. So not one, but 3 different cumulative effects will be done on all projects. So it's going to be an interesting exercise, because you have different firms, part on each one, and adopting, the methodology and coming up with, what is going to be the cumulative effects, not just on the existing projects, as you were saying, but any, reasonable foreseeable projects in the future. I guess in this case, probably Neuron/Wailu projects. So yeah, we'll see what's will be in scope on that, and I'm interested as well. What is the total effects on all these projects?
It was interesting, Mike. One comment I read too that had been brought forward during the terms of reference process was they wanted us to look at, and we're going to, the potential impacts of increased activity at Webequie's airport, due to the fact that the road would be in place, right? So, with the road in place, there might be more exploration activity, right? In the area as well too. And they were saying that, the team should look at, increased emissions, greenhouse gas emissions associated with that possibility of more air traffic at the airport in Webequie, which makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, roads. The whole purpose is not, for bicycles. It's for vehicles. Yeah. So I mean, there are things to consider, in the total scope, and that's it. That's not just for these roads and what the legislation say or the regulations say what we have to do. That's happening across the world, and I think even the New York Stock Exchange is now saying to companies that ESG and cumulative effects, downstream, upstream. So they're trying to define that scope as well. Like what's realistic for companies, to start calculating their emissions, not just on core operations, but suppliers, supply chains, and as well as downstream activities. So in our case, we do have some guidance, given to us by the federal government on cumulative effects, and so that helps a lot.
That's right. We have a study plan, right, that prescribes what we're to look at and how we're going to look at it as well. So yeah, it's a big topic, and it's going to become, like you said, it's going to be something that's going to become a lot more common in terms of a consideration, right? It'll become more important consideration on other projects moving forward. So those were the main comments that Marten Falls brought forward, and some great comments. And we're looking forward to visiting your community very soon, hopefully in the next month or two. Things are opening up a bit, which is great, which is fantastic. We're really looking forward to that. So in the meantime, we encourage you to go to our bi-weekly live stream sessions or radio shows on Wawate Radio Network. Visit our website at supplyroad.ca as well too. there's lots of information available to you about the project. We have all of our study plans, all the details of each study that's involved in the environmental assessment on the website as well too, as well as all kinds of information. Mike, you talked about the animation of building in the James Bay lowlands and the Muskeg areas as well too, to help community members understand that. That's up there as well. So, and feel free to contact us at any time if you want to meet with us, talk to us. Our door's always open, and we hope to see your community really soon. Actually, hopefully in the next month or two. And so with that, we'll leave it at that, and we will hopefully talk to you very soon. Don't forget supplyroad.ca, and don't forget our streaming sessions every other Wednesday. This week is no, it's next week. A week from Wednesday, we'll be back with the WSR live streaming sessions. So thank you very much for joining us today, Miigwech, and we will see you soon.